Closed-back headphones seem to always be a compromise to my ears at least. I never seem to enjoy them as much as an open-back headphone, and not just because they're not open-backed, but because they always seem to have some sort of trade-off in terms of their tuning. They're either a bit wonky, they're lacking in bass, there's always something just a little bit off. And so I'm really excited to have my hands on both the Meze Audio Liric 2 and also the Dan Clark Audio E3, and I'm doing something a little bit different here. I'm going to record both of these reviews back to back because it's really hard to choose between the Liric 2 and the Dan Clark Audio E3, and so it might take two videos for us to get there in terms of helping you decide which one's actually the right choice for you, because both are excellent, but both are flawed as well. Today, as you'll already know if you've clicked on this video, we're starting off with a look at the Meze Audio Liric 2. These come in at $2,000. They're a brand new offering from Meze Audio, and they're a closed-back planar magnetic headphone with an impedance of 30 ohms and sensitivity of 100 decibels per milliwatt, so pretty easy to drive, nothing too difficult. According to the marketing from Meze Audio, they're intended to balance a bit of extra warmth, but also clarity, and that's compared to the original Liric. I found the original Liric to be a little bit shouty, a little bit forceful, despite doing a lot of other things really well. And so I was hopeful that Meze had actually fixed some of the issues with the original Liric without going too far away from what they offered, and without going too far into the kind of tuning and presentation that I didn't enjoy quite so much with the Empyrean 2. And so let's jump straight into sound quality, and then I'll come back around at the end and talk about things like comfort, ergonomics, the accessories, all that sort of stuff. But I think the most important thing to talk about is sound quality, so let's jump into that first. The first thing that I noticed when I tried out the Liric 2 is they've got bass that's punchy and tactile, but not overdone in my opinion. And so what that means is that both the quality and the quantity of bass is excellent. The bass is tight and it's clean, despite having a little bit of emphasis to give it that impact and that energy. And then as we transition up into the mid-range, it's a really clean transition where there's no sense of bloat or excess warmth or richness through the mids. And in fact, I'd say the Liric 2s lean a little bit towards the upper mid-range emphasis rather than the lower mid-range emphasis. And whilst that's not always something that I enjoy, I think it works in their favour to keep the sound clean, detailed, and well separated from the bass. That emphasis does tend to extend further on up into the treble as well, and this is probably where I think, for me at least, the Liric 2s come undone just a tiny bit. It's not a big issue, but I feel like there's a little bit too much emphasis in some of the treble registers, and it does throw off the naturality of their sound just a little bit. I imagine the tuning that they've landed on with the Liric 2 is intended to bring that sense of clarity and energy and sparkle to the sound, and for the most part it does that really well. It just, as I said before, slightly gets into an unnatural timbre or tonality at times. And so I guess you could say we do still have a little bit of that closed back trade-off, but I don't think it's too bad. I think it is worth noting here that when I first put these on straight out of the box, they were actually significantly more treble emphasized. And in fact, my measurements showed the same thing. The bass and the treble were both stronger straight out of the box and seems to have settled after a number of hours of use. So don't judge these the second you take them out of the box. Give them some time to burn in, wear in, whatever you want to call it, but they do seem to change measurably and subjectively after you give them a bit of time. If we then move on from tonality and start talking about some of the technicalities of their sound, once again, and this is where the original Lyrics were also really strong, once again, we're getting a really nice sense of imaging and staging for a closed back headphone. The stage stretches relatively far out in front of you, again for closed back, and well out to the sides, probably slightly beyond the boundaries of your ears. So it's a nice spacious soundstage despite being a closed back headphone. Something I also appreciate is that the shape of the soundstage, where the sense of the boundaries of the soundstage are, is quite spherical. It's not quite a perfect sphere, it's more of a flattened out oval shape, but it's quite good in the sense that it's not really triangular, it's not really oblong, it's got a little bit of that sort of natural curvature to it. And so I think overall, Meze have landed on a really nice tuning for the Liric 2. It's dynamic, it's fun, it's punchy and engaging. It is a little tiny bit unnatural in the top end, as I said before, but I think most people are really going to enjoy the Liric 2. The fact that it's delivering both a relatively natural tonality and a good sense of staging in a closed back headphone, I think makes it a bit of a win. And the other thing that I like is that in comparison to the original Liric, I can listen to the Liric 2s on any of my systems. I don't have to be worried about them being too shouty or too forceful, and whilst I do prefer the Liric 2 from a slightly smoother treble source, such as a linear tube audio MZ3, or maybe using a tiny bit of a cut in the treble from the Mojo 2 equalizer for instance, I do prefer it ever so slightly with that treble tamed, but we're talking about a 1 or 2 dB difference. We're not talking about a significant need for reducing treble. And indeed, I can plug them directly into the Chord Dave or the Chord Dave into the Voyager or the Enlium Amp 23R, some of those really transparent and clean systems, and the Lyric 2 are still very, very enjoyable. However, as is often the case, when we have some excellent competition, as we probably do in the Dan Clark Audio E3 based on what I've seen and heard around the net, it was worth me doing a thorough comparison between the two before I made any conclusions about whether or not the Lyric 2 is a headphone that should be recommended. And so I'm going to jump into the comparisons with the E3 in just a second, but before we do, the one other thing I wanted to talk about that's related to sound quality directly is the isolation of the Lyric 2 is exceptional. They do a fantastic job of blocking out the outside world. They're almost in line with some of the active noise cancelling headphones out there. In other words, when they're active noise cancelling switched on, you can really put on something like the Lyric 2 and make the rest of the world disappear. They're probably not going to be quite so good in things like aeroplane situations where there is a lot of full bandwidth noise. But if you're in an office environment or you're at home and you want to block out the sound of people talking and stuff like that, that's where the Lyric 2s can be fantastic. So I'm not suggesting they're a direct replacement for an active noise cancelling headphone, as I said, in those commuting, transportation type situations. But for general blocking out of background talking, cafe noise, whatever it might be, they are absolutely fantastic. And so with that said, let's talk a bit about how they compare against the Dan Clark Audio E3. I'll be doing a full review of these in just a couple of days from now, so make sure you hit the subscribe button and ring the notification bell if you want to catch this one. But this is the Dan Clark Audio E3 headphone. It's also a closed back, it's also a planar magnetic, and it's also $2,000. So all of a sudden, we're spoilt for choice. We've got two beautiful looking, feeling, and performing headphones here. So yes, I'm letting the cat out of the bag. The E3 is excellent. We've got two fantastic headphones here. The question is, which one's going to be better for you? And so I've done some extensive listening to both of these headphones, and I'm actually going to talk about the comparisons between the two twice over the course of the next two videos. And that's because I think they're very difficult to choose between. And the best way for me to explain why is to start sharing you my journey of listening with a whole lot of tracks across both these headphones. Now, for all of my listening, I use the exact same source chain. I use different source chains at different times with both these headphones, but for my specific comparisons, what I always used was my PC as a transport. That's running a high-quality JCAT USB card, feeding out through a tubulous Consensus USB cable. That's going into the Chord M scaler, which then feeds into the Chord Dave via a pair of Analysis Plus silver Apex B and C cables. And then from there, the signal goes through a pair of Curious XLR cables and out to the Burson Audio Voyager. Now, I chose the Voyager because it was the better amp in my opinion for actually both of these headphones. I do also have the Enlium Amp 23R, which is a little bit crisper in the treble, perhaps a touch more transparent. But I actually find that both of these headphones benefited from the slightly sort of more refined, smoother, whatever you want to call it, the slightly more mellow sound, very slightly, but the slightly more mellow sound from the Voyager. That's why I chose that amp. Having said that, both of these headphones need the sort of slightly mellower sound for different reasons, as I'll explain here. The first track that I made my notes on here is Man of War by Radiohead. And starting off with the Lyric 2, the opening guitar and synth work on this track is very crisp and articulate from the Lyric 2. The cymbals sound very natural with a good sense of shimmer. Nothing sounds off there, despite the slight enhancement of treble from the Lyric 2. And the bass is warm and full. And one of the things I noticed specifically was that each time the bass string is plucked in this track, you can kind of feel a fresh impact, a fresh sense of air movement from the Lyric 2. When Tom York's vocals come in, they're quite close to the listener via Lyric 2, so it's fairly intimate, but there's a good sense of separation between his vocals and the rest of the instrumentation. Listening to this track on the Lyric 2s, it is quite a wall of sound, but I don't mean that in a bad way in the sense that it's not dead flat. It's just there's a lot going on and it's all coming at you at once, but as you listen to it, it's really nicely separated. You can pull it apart if you want to. It's not artificially pulled apart in any way by the Lyric 2. When the distorted guitar in this track comes in at about 1 minute 50, it's really clear, it's clean in the sense that it's crunchy and crisp, but it's also very well separated from the rest of the instruments. And so overall, as I continue to listen to this track, the sound of the Lyric 2 does come across a touch V-shaped. There's a little bit of sub-emphasis or deeper bass emphasis. There's a little bit of treble emphasis. but it doesn't rob the vocals of their presence and their energy and their kind of place in the overall mix. So it's a very enjoyable experience listening to the Lyric 2, and then that begs the question of whether or not the E3s can match up to that experience. Moving over now to the E3, restarting the track, and the first thing I noticed was that opening passage of guitar and synth is more articulate, a little bit more crisp, a little bit more defined from the E3. I also felt like I could hear a little bit more nuance from the bass guitar work through the E3. I could now hear Colin Greenwood's fingers sliding up and down the fretboard as he changed positions for the notes. But at the same time, I think the reason I could hear those details is that the sense of weight and presence of the bass is backed off fairly significantly from the E3 compared to the Lyric 2. So the bass doesn't have the same presence or impact that I was enjoying from the Lyric 2. The E3 also delivers the cymbals quite differently in this track. They have less presence and less of the sense of shimmer from the E3 that they got from the Lyric 2. There's no way to know which one's correct, and both were fine, but there's a clear difference once again in the treble presentation from both of these headphones. Thinking now about the vocals, and Tom York's vocal, which was a little bit intimate from the Lyric 2, is actually now even closer to me from the E3. I felt like I was actually right up in my forehead from the E3 compared to just a little bit forward in the Lyric 2. The sibilance from Tom York's vocals, so s sounds and t sounds, that was also a bit more prominent, a bit more forceful from the E3. I wouldn't say it was sibilant or harsh, but it was definitely more prominent. And so what I found was the E3 was focusing me more on the vocals and putting everything else a bit more secondary in the mix. Again, I'm not going to say which one's better or worse, they're just different presentations. When those distorted guitars come in at about the 1 minute 50 mark, again, things are quite different. And what I'd say is the E3 put more emphasis on the crunch and the detail of the guitar and less on the weight and the power and the presence of it. As the track continues to build and get a little bit busier, this is where things really started to separate for me between the two. And some people might like what the E3 does, some people might like what the Lyric 2 does. Specifically what I heard was that as things got busier, there was more overall emphasis in the mid-range and the upper mid-range from the E3, and to my ears and my preferences, the sound was less complete from the E3 because the bass became quite lost and quite secondary. When we look at the measurements of the E3 compared to the Lyric 2, it's got a lot less of the mid-bass and even the lower mid-range compared to what the Lyric does, and you do hear that on certain tracks. There's a bit of a gap, there's a bit of a hole between the sub-bass and the mid-range, and that took away some of the completeness and the full range experience of listening to a track like Man of War, where the E3s had me focused entirely on things like vocals, guitars, etc., versus from the Lyric 2, it was more like I would expect to hear in a live venue where I could hear the bass, the lower drums, all the instruments coming together into a full musical experience. Now again, that's my preferences only, that's how I like to hear the music. You might really love what I'm saying about the E3, that's totally fine. It's also so far only one track, so let's keep going and I'll talk about some other tracks that I listened to on both of these and see if that helps you further understand what I was hearing. Moving to a fresh and completely different track now in Sing by Jon Batiste, and starting off with the E3 this time, Jon Batiste's vocals sound great from the E3 to start off with. They're still quite intimate to the listener, so quite close to you as the listener from the E3, but the quality of the sound is very, very good. There's some hand claps at the beginning of this track, and they're quite crisp and quite clean. And as the track continues, I'd say that the stage presentation from the E3 is quite wide, but it's also fairly flat. So the sound is like a squashed oval sounding soundstage rather than that more spherical sound that I described earlier from the Lyric 2. Having said that, this could be the track, so we'll wait and see what my notes were for the Lyric 2. Off the top of my head, I don't remember. But as I listened more from the E3, once again what I found was there was a sense of emphasis towards the mid-range and particularly the upper mid-range. That seems to be how they present all sounds. It's not just about that last recording we talked about. And again, the bass comes across a bit secondary. With the tuning of the E3, they tend to emphasize the lower bass rather than the mid bass, as I said before. And so on a track like this that's just using, I can't remember if it's a double bass or an electric bass, but either way, unless it's going really deep, it is going to come off secondary to most of the other instruments. Having said that, there are some deep bass notes and some kick bass hits at the end of this track, and those are presented beautifully from the E3. It's got wonderful bass capabilities and quality. It's just kind of reserved for the lower, almost the sub-bass area rather than the mid-bass area. And that for me is not so good. I do prefer the bass to stretch a little bit higher without obviously getting bloated or slow or muddy, but the E3 does leave me wanting a little bit more presence in that mid-bass range. Switching then over to the Lyric 2 and starting the track again, and the first thing I noticed was the vocal is just a little bit more distant from me. I feel like there's a little bit more space to breathe as a listener. As I listen further, I think the Lyric 2 brings a bit more emphasis to the textures of the vocals, and that's going to be coming from the treble emphasis and the way the treble is emphasized from the Lyric 2s. Whether it's better or worse, I don't really know. It's just a different sound once again. And interestingly, the sound of the hand claps that I talked about from the E3 is much less prominent from the Lyric 2. And so those sharp sort of upper mid-range, lower treble sounds like hand claps and snare hits, you're going to get more of those from E3, you're going to get less of it from the Lyric 2 compared to the other frequencies in the range. I did find with the Lyric 2 that its emphasis meant that occasionally there were certain vocal sounds that were a little tiny bit unnatural in the sense that they were distracting, not so much that they were bad. It didn't make it a completely wonky sounding tuning, but I was aware of the fact that there was some coloration, particularly jumping between the E3 and the Lyric 2 like this. Across the board, the bass is more present and authoritative from the Lyric 2. As I've already said, it's not slow, it's not muddy, but it's definitely got more weight behind it. If we then come back around to the vocal, I said before that there was some treble emphasis that at times made it just a little tiny bit unnatural, but I should say that overall the sound of the vocal had a bit more richness and body to it, and I think it made it a more natural overall experience across the whole frequency range. So the upper registers of vocals can be just a little bit off at times from the Lyric 2, but I think the overall balance is actually better in my opinion because a male vocal gets a better sense of that lower mid-range and upper bass resonance and presence that I think occasionally the E3 just doesn't quite have enough of. Listening on and thinking about the technicalities of soundstage size, scale, image placement, etc. And I think this track doesn't actually give us a lot of scale to work with, but I do think the Lyric 2 is just giving a little tiny bit more than the E3 does. It's still a relatively flat, relatively wide soundstage, but not quite as squashed as the E3 presents it. And then the final thing to mention is that at the end of the track, I talked before about the fact there are some deep bass notes and some kick bass hits, and they're far more satisfying to me from the Lyric 2. It really has the power and the presence to deliver those notes with authority in a way that the E3 can't really do. The E3 reserves all of its energy for the deep bass, and therefore any of the resonance, any of the harmonics, any of the kind of natural sounds being produced, the fundamentals being produced, those are a little bit lacking from the E3 as it creeps up in the bass range, whereas I feel like the Lyric 2 manages it across the board. And so on a track like this, and probably on Man of War as well, I'm leaning a little bit towards the Lyric 2. But at this stage, I'd mostly listen to more popular music, and so I wanted to check out how both of these performed on a classical track, and that's the next comparison. For this test, I ended up listening to this track, I'm not even going to try and say it, and starting off with the Lyric 2 this time, the solo violin here really sings from the Lyric 2. Its bit of treble emphasis brings out the brightness and the clarity of the violin without actually making it artificial sounding. So this is where, as I said before, there is that upper emphasis from the Lyric 2 that very occasionally makes things sound a bit off, but it doesn't always make things sound off, and I think that's an important clarification. Some closebacks that I've tried, you kind of have to remove your brain from the equation and not think too hard about whether or not it sounds natural, because it's just going to permanently sound unnatural if you think too much about it. Whereas I find with the Lyric 2, for the most part, you can kind of critically listen with them. It's going to occasionally draw your attention to things being a little bit unnatural, but not that often. And so on a track like this, with a solo violin, the Lyric 2 started off beautifully. Something else that I really liked is that the orchestra has presence and body and authority behind that solo, and the separation is strong between all the different sounds of the orchestra. Whether or not it's the recording or the headphones on this track, I'm not entirely sure, but it was a really interesting presentation where, from the Lyric 2, I felt like I was standing on stage where the conductor would be, and I had the solo violinist in front of me and the rest of the orchestra kind of wrapped around. It was a very enjoyable presentation. And as I listened more and more to the rest of this track, there weren't a lot of individual details to pull out, but what I would say is that I was thoroughly enjoying it from the Lyric 2. They don't sound as open and expansive on a track like this as a good quality open back headphone, but I never felt congested, closed in, or lacking anything as I listened to Lyric 2. As I then moved over to the E3, it was quite a different experience. And the first thing I noticed was the tonality of the violin was very, very different. I don't really know which one I would say is truly correct. To my ears, having been a violinist for 10 plus years, I felt like the Lyric 2 sounded more accurate to my ears. But having said that, it's also been that long since I have picked up a violin and played that I could be a little bit off on that one. All I can tell you is that the Lyric 2 was more pleasing to me. The E3 sounded a little bit artificial in some ways. The violin sounded a little bit too, brittle's the wrong word, but there was a bit too much of the upper range emphasis, not as much of the warmth and resonance of the body of the violin. And so I think the Lyric 2 would win out slightly for me here. Once again, the separation of individual sounds is fantastic from the E3, but I did feel like the orchestra lacked a bit of presence and a bit of weight behind that solo violinist. I didn't get the sense that I was listening to a big, full-scale orchestra with larger instruments, with many instruments. It didn't have that sense of authority behind it that I think the Lyric 2 delivers really well. On the other hand, I do think the E3 had the better sense overall of a more natural upper range delivery. What I mean by that is that the frequencies from the mid-range through to treble, I think are a little bit more natural overall. As I said, the solo violin maybe not so much, but with everything else, I think the E3 is just balancing out the treble, the mid-range, a little bit better on classical music. And so continuing to listen with both the E3 and the Lyric 2, to me the E3 is possibly a more technical delivery. It's perhaps a little bit more correct from a frequency response point of view, at least in the upper registers from mid-range above. I think the Lyric 2 might be more correct from mid-range below. But what I found was that with the E3, it was a technical listening experience. With the Lyric 2, it was an emotional listening experience. I was drawn into the music with the Lyric 2, whereas I was just listening to the music with the E3. And that's where I think that both of these headphones are going to have different groups of people that really, really enjoy them. And to the point that I think it's very hard to split the two. As I've said a few times now, in a lot of cases, I prefer the Lyric 2. It hits the marks for my preferences better, but it doesn't mean that I think it is necessarily the better headphone. It's just the one that I might choose. And so I think ultimately what we've got here are two very, very good headphones. And that's why, as I said earlier or alluded to earlier in the video, that's why I'm actually taking two videos to really draw my full conclusions and hopefully to help you choose which is right for you. And so for now, I'm going to leave this one here from a sound quality point of view by saying that I think out of the two, I would choose the Lyric 2. I would potentially use it more often with something like a Mojo 2, where I can pull back a little bit of the treble, or with a slightly smoother top-end amp like a Voyager or a Linear Tube Audio MZ3, something that's just a little bit rolled off in the treble, maybe a tube amp. That's where I think they're going to be at their very, very best. But as I said, I've used them across everything that I own and they work a treat, as do the E3, but in a different way. And so I'm going to park the comparisons here for now and just spend a little bit of time talking to you about the fit, the comfort, the accessories of the Lyric 2. And by the way, don't forget, if you want to know more about the Lyric 2 versus the E3 from a sound quality point of view, remember to hit the subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you don't miss the E3 review, where we'll revisit this comparison with different tracks and going a bit deeper still. But for now, looking at the Lyric 2 as a headphone, these once again are a beautifully designed headphone, as we've come to expect from Meze. I'll talk a little bit about the specific design cues in here in a second, some of the choices they've made, whether I like them or not. But before we do, let's quickly talk about the accessories. If you buy yourself a set of Lyric 2s, you're going to get, and this is great that they now include this, you're going to get the high quality upgrade cable, and it's the copper one that comes with it. As far as I know, that's always going to be the case. I think it's the right choice given the treble qualities of the Lyric 2. And so you get this lovely, fairly short copper cable with the Lyric 2. This is going to be perfect for mobile use. But then you also get, in the carry case, you also get a pouch with the longer style rubberized cable as well. It's not as good of a cable, but it's going to give you a good option if you need a longer reach. As for the carry case that I just mentioned, that's it here. It is fairly chunky, so you do need to be aware of that. These are a less portable headphone than something like the E3, which I'll show you in that video how compact and tiny that gets. This is a less portable option in my opinion. This case is taking up a lot of space. Even though, when we look at the headphones themselves, the headphones are actually very compact. The cups are smaller than the cups on the E3. The headband is actually less going on because you haven't got the two layers that you do on the E3 with the suspension band and the spring band over the top. So this is actually a more simple compact design on the head, but because it only folds flat like so for transportation, it doesn't get as small. So take that into account if that's important for you. If you're traveling regularly, commuting regularly with your closed back headphones, the E3 is probably the better choice unless you don't like the sound of what I've described from a sound quality point of view. However, if sound is what you're after and commuting is less important, these are absolutely phenomenal. They are supremely comfortable. They've got this beautiful headband here with multiple padding types. I'll get better shots in the B-roll here that you can see, but on the padding underneath the headband here, it's actually divided into little sections. And so it spreads out the load very evenly. It doesn't create hotspots. They're wonderfully comfortable. If we follow that down to the yokes here, we've got this piston style adjustment that's really easy to adjust, but then holds its place beautifully. We've got plenty of rotation and swivel in the cups to get a good fit. And then as we get down to the cups themselves, they've got this beautiful ebony wood backing. It is actually real wood. I thought it was fake initially. It's so beautifully finished. I thought it was a synthetic, but it is actually a real wooden cup with this little bass vent in there as well. And I thought this was quite interesting that both of these headphones, being the E3 and the Lyric 2, both have their own version of bass porting and or pressure equalization systems. And that's probably, I'm guessing, a part of how both of them are getting such great sound. So it's really nice to see both doing that and getting great results from it. If we then look inside the cups here, we've got these quality plush leather pads, or maybe fake leather, I haven't looked into that, but these plush pads, very comfortable pads. And a nice change from the original Lyric is that they're now removable with the same magnetic style system that's been used on the Empyreans and the Elites. So that's fantastic. It appears they're still using the pad volume as part of the internal volume for the actual driver to work in. And what I mean by that, the original Lyrics had a system where the airflow from the back of the driver could actually get up into the inside of the pads, and that's why they didn't have removable pads. Now, if you have a look at the back of these, there's a series of holes on the back of the pad. There's also a series of aligned holes on the cup itself. And that's going to mean that some of the airflow, some of the pressure coming off the back of the driver can go into the foam inside these pads and essentially use the volume of the pad to add to the volume of the cup without having to make the cup bigger. And that's fantastic. It keeps a nice small cup, but it gives plenty of room for that driver to work, to breathe, to move air, etc. While I've got the pads off, it's also worth mentioning the new technology here. There's this little section here that's called the Quarter Wavelength Resonator Mask, or QWRM. And what that's designed to do is to minimize some of the frequency boosting and elevation that happens naturally above 7 kilohertz. Apparently, because of the wavelength at 7 kilohertz and above, by blocking off some of the outlets from the driver at that particular position, they're able to tame some of the treble, and that might have helped to reduce some of the peakiness that the Lyric original had. Having said that, as I've already described, I do think these have slightly enhanced treble still, but I enjoy the end results, so that might just be working. Now, while we're talking about the driver itself, something that we can't see in here, but which is talked about in the marketing, is that apparently Meze have introduced, in collaboration with Renaro, who make their drivers, they've introduced what's called the Phase X system. Now, this is patent pending. It's not really explained on the website very much, if at all, but what's being done inside here is that apparently they've looked at the timing correctness of all the signals coming off the driver to ensure that you get very good phase accuracy or timing accuracy. And the theory behind that is that it helps with our spatial understanding of where different sounds come from. And that's definitely true. Timing accuracy is incredibly important for imaging and stage understanding for our brains. And I think based on what I'm hearing, whether or not it's the Phase X or other factors or a combination is hard to say. But what I hear when I listen to the Lyric 2 is a very good imaging and staging headphone, for a closed back in particular. And particularly in comparison to the E3, that I do feel falls a little bit short there. The E3 is no slouch by any stretch, but I think the Lyric 2 is doing a better job of staging, both in terms of stage size and scale and shape, but also in terms of the image placement and image accuracy as well. I feel like I can better pick the specific placement in space of all the instruments in 3 dimensions. I think the E3 does it beautifully left-right, but less so in terms of depth. And so it seems that maybe the Phase X system is working well. As I said, maybe there's other factors going into it, but the end result is, I think technically, the Lyric 2 is a big step forward over the original. And so to finish off the tour here, if we come down to the bottom of the cups, we've got dual 3.5mm entries. That's fantastic. A, it means you've got a really nice simple connector that you can use with both of the cables that are included, but it also means that if you are someone that likes to upgrade cables, if you've already got different cables at home, it's very easy to swap over if you've got 3.5mm cables, or if you want to go out and buy cables, 3.5 is fantastic because it goes from Meze Audio, in terms of the Lyric 2 at least, across to things like Hyphaman and other brands too. And so I think the total package of the Lyric 2 is fantastic. It's not entirely perfect. It's not as portable or transportable as other options on the market, such as the E3. Its tonality is a little bit V-shaped. It's not entirely natural, although I think it's pretty good. And so it's not the perfect headphone that I can sit here and say, this is the one to buy for $2,000. But I think if your tastes generally align with mine and you don't need a super compact portable headphone, I think the Lyric 2 is absolutely brilliant. Build quality and comfort-wise, I think it's the best thing I've played with in terms of a closed-back portable headphone, so long as you don't need that really fold-up compact design. And so hopefully I've been able to paint a good picture for you of the Lyric 2, what they're about, what they're good at, not so good at, etc. And if it does sound like the perfect headphone for you and you're ready to jump in and make a purchase, I'll put some links down below that you can use to go directly through to Meze Audio and anywhere else I can find them that I think might be helpful. And some of those will be affiliate links, so thank you to anyone and everyone that uses those. It's a great support to the channel. For now though, don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell if you want to see the E3 review and hear a bit more about how these two compare if you're stuck trying to work out which one's better like I was. And in some ways still am, because I still don't know which one to recommend 100%. And I hope that for now you've found this part of this process helpful and informative. If you have, please hit the like button. But for now, let me leave it to the music, so happy listening, be kind to each other, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.